All right, hi everyone. Now I'm gonna start in just a minute, but just so everyone can join, I'm gonna give just a minute for everyone to take a look. Hi. All right, there we go. So we're going to just make sure to take a look at the study guide that's on the link in the bio, so you can sort of follow along as to everything that I'm talking about. I'm going to go over essentially just everything here. I'm going over a little bit more than is actually going to be necessary for the test, but just giving you some context and stuff that I hope would be covered during the next section of the unit. So we're going to start with Atlantic revolutions, and basically this is one of the key points here. So as it comes to governance, political order in Europe and the Americas is going to dramatically change from European power sharing power between monarchs and the wealthy, powerful, influential nobles to many more people in sort of a spread of Enlightenment ideals. I'm going to get to the Enlightenment just a little bit later, but I just want to start by outlining some of the key things that we need to know here. So we're going to start with the American Revolution, and the important thing here to know is that it was sparked by a variety of trends: nationalism, objection to the British economic policy that was happening here, lack of general representation of the Americans in Parliament, which was the British the British Congress, essentially, support for capitalism over the mercantilist systems, and most importantly to this unit, Enlightenment philosophy. Now, essentially what's happening here is documents like the Declaration of Independence, especially, written by Thomas Jefferson, that was sort of following the intellectual lead of thinkers like John Locke, Charles Montesquieu, and many others, and you can pretty clearly see that their ideas of property, rights to property, rights of natural law, rights of basically all the natural rights that we have essentially been granted in their philosophy. And I'm going to go over more specifically what each of them means a little bit later, but just for a general idea. Now, we all kind of know the story here. Revolution breaks out in 1775. George Washington and the Americans kind of struggle to make headway. They're losing to the British, but then late 1770s, early 1780s, they really begin to make a major shift in what they're doing. Their popular support for the revolution starts to grow. They gain support of the French in the revolution. The Americans overtake the British forces at Yorktown in 1781, and peace talks go on until 1783, when eventually we get our own country. 1787, Constitutional Convention led to the United States Constitution, and some of the most important things here is that the United States Constitution is an Enlightenment document, and it is based on the ideals of Enlightenment thought, popular sovereignty, and basically power sharing among the three branches of government. That's especially a Montesquieu ideal, but just so you know. Elections were still indirect. Women and Native Americans could not vote. Black people could rarely vote, and there was no outlawing of slavery. And while these got changed over time, this was the reality of the situation there. In addition, this revolution, being kind of the first of the major Atlantic revolutions, would later inspire many of the later revolutions. Next, we have the French Revolution, which was sparked by the socioeconomic gap, the unfair tax system, general long-term debt that the French had been incurring for their wars since the reign of Louis XIV, who was an important character in our last time period, as well as, of course, the general thing that sticks among all of these, Enlightenment philosophy. Now, a big problem was that under the laws that were currently written, they could not tax the first or second estates. Those were the clergy, which is the people from the church, and the aristocracy, so all the really rich people who were generally somehow landowning, rich and powerful, essentially. So King Louis XVI, the king at the time, could not solve France's financial crisis, so in an effort to sort of try to get a range of experts to work on it, he summoned the Estates Generales. I apologize to pronounce it the Dutch way, and people say that it sounds weird. But which is the National Assembly of Delegates, made up of the First Estate, the clergy, the Second Estate, the aristocrats, and most importantly, the Third Estate, which was everyone else, 96% of the population. And an important thing to know was that each estate only got an equal share of the vote. So that means that basically the Third Estate is the one that's 96% is getting just as much of the vote as the 1% First Estate and the 3% Second Estate. Now, I apologize that I'm not going slower for this. I just want to, there's a lot to get to here. I have 20 pages of study guide, as you guys can see, so I just want to make sure that I'm able to get to everything. So, the First and Second Estates were not really willing to seriously negotiate to change the tax system, which the Third Estate felt was really the only reasonable way in which revolution could be avoided, and there would be a reasonable solution to the debt crisis and its ensuing effects, which were the soaring costs of living across everything. So, especially notably bread, which the famous Queen Marie Antoinette claimed to the French people, let them eat cake, because she was so out of touch that she didn't understand that cake was more expensive than bread. So the Third Estate essentially seceded from the Estates Generales and formed the National Assembly. Then they kind of barricaded themselves inside the Palace of Versailles until the king granted them a constitution. And this, among with popular support for the National Assembly in events like the storming of the Bastille, which was when the people basically took over an important building in France, the National Assembly basically begins to assume power in Paris. Now, Louis XVI, a common misconception is that he was not allowed to remain king. He actually was allowed to remain king, but with severely reduced powers, similar to parliamentary monarchies seen across Europe at this time. The National Assembly created the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Now, this is an important thing to know, and because this is one of the most important Enlightenment documents that will actually be tested on exams like this, including the AP exam. The National Assembly basically granted civil liberties in this document, and its writing was overseen by the noble, although very liberal noble, the Marquis de Lafayette, who, as some of you know, probably significantly helped the Americans sort of talk to the French during their revolution. The motto of France became Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which is liberty, equality, fraternity. And while initially these rights to vote originally only applied to white adult Catholic males, it was slowly and progressively expanded throughout French history. Now, slavery is ended in the French colonies and only in 1794. Now, this is going to become an important point later as we get to the Haitian Revolution, but make sure to remember that it is not abolished when it is when the French Revolution first happens. Now, Louis XVI, encouraged by his wife Marie Antoinette and many aristocrats there, planned a counter-revolution that would essentially try to take back their power from the National Assembly. Additionally, the urban lower classes and middle-class idealists, known as the sans-culottes, wanted to end the monarchy, persecute former aristocrats, end Catholicism, and force their revolution onto other countries through the use of force and war. And this basically greatly radicalized elements of the revolution, and led to France's eventual wars with Austria, Prussia, and Britain. Unfortunately, this was exactly the problem that got the French here in the first place. So the economy worsened, military failures caused mass hysteria, and the aristocrats, the political moderates, and the royal family all fell under further suspicion. Then, fall of 1792, the elections brought the radical Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, to power. And here they rewrite the constitution so it strips the king of all powers and proclaims the French Republic. The Jacobins created the Committee of Public Safety, which assumed essentially dictator powers and transformed French society by killing a lot of people. They expanded the war effort. As I previously mentioned, France was at war with quite a few countries at this time. They mobilized the economy to be ready for combat and ordered a draft. and this was extremely unpopular and led to civil war with the people of the countryside. However, the Jacobins continued with their sort of insanity happening here, and they executed King Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette in 1793. The summer of 1793, so really after King Louis had already been executed but before Marie Antoinette, was known as the Reign of Terror, and civil liberties were entirely ignored, and people were just arrested, tried, and publicly executed. To the point, this essentially caused mass suspicion and mob rule to the point where Maximilien Robespierre, the leader of this, is actually executed himself, leading to the end of the Reign of Terror. Now, after this, they're replaced by the Directory, a very moderate but overall pretty unpopular regime that didn't do anything particularly important besides stabilizing the military situation. Then there's a coup d'etat in 1799, and Napoleon Bonaparte, among others, ousts the Directory and seized power for himself. He claimed to be of revolutionary ideals, and in certain ways was, but ended up creating a dictatorship where in 1804 he crowned himself emperor. In 1803, Napoleon, already in power but not yet emperor, was kind of afraid based on what was happening across the world in Haiti and in other French territories, and sold the vast Louisiana territory to the United States for a very, very low price in the famous Louisiana Purchase. Now, this vastly shifted global power to help the United States and would help the United States build up from sort of an unimportant country to one of the most important in the world during just this short time span. 1805 to 1811, Napoleon continues increasing French power, making France the most powerful country in Europe, controlling basically the entirety of Europe outside of Russia and Britain. But then their general inability to counter the British Navy, resistance to his authority in Spain, which you can see through a lot of artwork at this time, and of course attempting to invade the coldest country on earth, Russia, in the winter, brought Napoleon's initial downfall, and led to his exile in 1814. However, he escaped from capture and led the army back into the Battle of Waterloo when he was finally beaten again. Then, from 1814 to 1815, to grapple with all of the effects of the Napoleonic rule, the Congress of Vienna was called to restore peace in Europe. And an important thing now, having summarized the French Revolution, is that it ended absolute monarchy in Europe, as this kind of showed the importance of monarchs yielding their authority to legislatures, ministries, things that are more controlled by the people. So this really was hugely influential in Europe and is one of the most hugely influential events of this time period. Next is the Haitian Rebellion, or the Haitian Revolution. Now, Saint-Domingue, or Santo Domingo, depending on which country was controlling each part of the island, was a sugar and coffee-producing colony split between Spanish and French rule that was majority population of slaves from Africa. Now, as I previously mentioned, the French rights of the man and citizen did not free slaves. So the slaves of Saint-Domingue revolted in August 1791, marking the beginning of the Haitian Rebellion. Now, in 1793, Toussaint Louverture led the revolt and was sort of seeking to gain full independence and liberate slaves not only on the French side, but wanted to expand it to the Spanish side of the island as well. So in 1798, he had worked to invade the Spanish side of the island, and leading to really scaring the French here, because in 1802, Napoleon sends a pretty large force to quash the rebellion, and this force eventually captures Louverture. But due to sort of tropical problems here, the French died in large numbers out of yellow fever and were actually defeated by the former slaves on Haiti. So in 1804, Haiti was born as an independent nation, the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas here, and sorry, not the Western Hemisphere, just the in the Americas over here, and becoming really the first and only former slave colony, slave revolt to really succeed during this time period. Now, South American Wars of Independence is the other thing that we sort of need to talk about, and I separated this out in the study guide between South American and Central American because they are fairly separate, so I think that that's actually quite helpful to take a look at just so that you all know. Now, South American Wars of Independence came as a result of a growing sense of nationalism, resentment of Spanish and Portuguese economic and social policies. Specifically, if you all remember from the last time period, there was the Peninsulare class, below them was the Criollo class, and then the mixed races, and then the Native Americans and the slaves. So what ended up happening was the Criollo class, remember the second class here, was severely restricted by this rigid social hierarchy here, even though they were Europeans and felt that they deserved equal rights as the Peninsulares. They felt that they were not being granted that. And Napoleon's invasions of Spain and Portugal, I see I made a mistake here, 1807 to 1809, led to the toppling of the colonial order in Latin America that was dominated by the Spanish, and eventually led to the revolutions that popped up throughout South and Central America. And one of the most key figures during this time period is Simón Bolívar. He was a Venezuelan Criollo who was inspired by Enlightenment ideals, frustrated with Spanish rule, and importantly, being a distinction from other sort of leaders of revolutions at this time, he promised to fight for the rights of mixed-race Latin Americans and for the emancipation of the slaves at this over here. In 1810, he took control over the independence movement over the northern part of Spanish South America, so essentially Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, parts of like Brazil area, all of that upper area, with the idea of creating something called Gran Colombia, which would encompass all of northern South America. So he kind of took up the reins of the Tupac Amaru, the second rebellion of 1780s Peru, something else that you should just know sort of the name of. This was another rebellion. And very famously wrote a letter known as the Jamaica Letter in 1815 that showcased this ideals and sort of argued, especially to the Criollo class, although to every Criollo and Peninsulare classes, although to everyone really, that were like, these ideals were important here. He transformed this upper middle class rebellion that we had previously into a real like war of independence supported by the majority populace of the country. In 1819 to 1821, he basically gains control of Venezuela, Colombia, northern South America, and joins forces with another guy named José de San Martín. Now, José de San Martín is essentially the Simón Bolívar of southern South America, and from 1816 to 1820, he'd been freeing southern areas like Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay from Spanish rule. In 1825, royalists are finally cleared out of Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, fully freeing South America and allowing for the creation of independent states like Gran Colombia. Now, there was some power sharing between Bolivar and San Martin, but eventually, unfortunately, due to like corruption and economic imperialism, these democracies didn't last for a long time and are still somewhat shaky even to today, as we'll see, especially in the next time period with the CIA and everything, that other countries continue to exploit this weakness, which sort of works against what they're trying to do here. Now, Central America. So that's basically Mexico and the smaller states south of it. The priest Manuel Hidalgo calls for independence from Spain. And this is notable because he is a priest, a member of the clergy calling for independence, and this is one of the few examples of that being the case. Now, this sparks the Mexican War of Independence, where Hidalgo eventually gets killed. However, when he gets killed, another priest named Jose Maria Morelos took the mantle. And something that both Morelos and Hidalgo did was that they called for constitutional rule, equal rights for Native Americans and mestizos, and slave liberation. Now, in 1815, conservative Mexicans ended up killing Morelos, allowing for the 1821 rise of Agustín de Iturbide, who overthrew the Spanish rule with the support of like the elites, but didn't end up doing sort of the general popular mass revolution that would sort of happen in Bolivar's South America. So Iturbide establishes himself as a dictator, but then is fairly quickly ousted. In 1823, the Mexican Republic is proclaimed, And further south, the United Provinces of Central America, which is all of those Central American countries, sort of as one bigger country, is established. Now, there's a lot of what's happening here is a new imperialism, which has a more aggressive, more systematic character than what was happening in the older imperialism, and led to a great wealth of power for Europe and America, but a whole lot of bloodshed, racial prejudice, slavery that still is felt in its effects today. And this was motivated by a need for raw materials from overseas markets and for industrialization. And Western sea power and their military superiority really depended on their control of of colonies around the world. And so Europe's rapid population growth caused migration to the Americas and other settler colonies, which are places where settlers displace indigenous people, form a colony, etc. Advances in geography and science, specifically like mapping and finding anti-malarial and anti-sickness drugs such as quinine, sort of led to the ways that they could establish themselves in more tropical areas that were unlike Europe in their sort of systems. And a major fuel of this, beyond the need for raw materials, was the belief in racial superiority, fueled by a concept known as social Darwinism, which is essentially applying Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest to race-based survival, that somehow because white people in Europe were able to industrialize faster, they were better equipped to live in the world than everyone else in the world, and that they had somehow a duty to teach and modernize people. Something that the famous British writer and notorious racist Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden, and something that the French called la mission civilisatrice. Now, empires were essentially governed with different degrees of severity. Britain, the sun never set on the British Empire. British Empire was the largest empire. France was the second largest. And while Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands sort of held on to some colonial possessions, Germany, Italy, sort of began to really build up their overseas empire during this time. And remember, Germany and Italy are actually just formed during this time, so it makes sense that they don't have a lot of colonial holdings. I'll get into the process of their unification a little bit later, but that's just something to know. Austria had the largest land-based empire at this time in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. This would eventually become Austria-Hungary and a focal point for World War I. But they were really colliding with the Ottomans here, which set up kind of a big fight between the two biggest land-based powers in Europe at the time. That sort of somewhat separated them from everything else that seemed to be going on with overseas imperialism. In addition, Russia would end up conquering much, much, much further east into Siberia, Central Asia, and even parts of North America, what we now know as Alaska, but is basically like that huge swath of land up there that they would eventually sell to the United States. Japan ended up conquering parts of mainland Asia, areas in China, as well as parts of Southeastern Asia, parts of Indonesia, Malaysia, that sort of area they ended up capturing, as well as many other islands in the South China Sea. In addition, an important thing to note here is economic imperialism, which is not exactly the same as some of the other imperialism that we're seeing, in the sense that they aren't trying to fully control the colonies through political means, but rather pressuring nations to offer favorable trade terms and economic terms to major imperial powers under threat of invasion, under threat of mass displacement, etc. So this was practiced really in Latin America, China, and Egypt, most notably. So then we have geopolitical tension. So there's a steady rise in global conflict here that's kind of accompanying the rise in imperialism right now. And a big thing that's happening right now is that the Ottoman Empire is declining in its power. And as you guys may remember, the Ottoman Empire is important in the first time period from 1200 to 1450. It's important in the second time period from 1450 to 1750, and it's still important in this period right now. But right now, the Ottoman Empire is having serious decline, which leads to something known as the Eastern Question, which is how do we fill the power vacuum caused in the Balkans by this Ottoman decline? And one of the big things that's happening right now as well is in Central Asia. There's sort of a decline in power there, and British and Russian spheres of influence are sort of colliding here in something known as the Great Game. Additionally, from the 1880s to the 1910s is something known as the Scramble for Africa, which was a rush to colonize the African continent. And all of this was empowered and sort of brought about by a growing intensity of nationalism in Western nations that created a spirit of patriotism, sometimes kind of rudely known as jingoism, from people who look down upon it. Finally, so there's sort of a peaceful period after the Congress of Vienna, which I mentioned previously, in Europe, so from around 1814 up until 1853, when the Crimean War happens in Crimea, which is modern-day Ukraine, that area. And eventually Russia's defeat here led to the rising nationalist movement of Pan-Slavism. Now, Pan-Slavism is the belief of one Slavic nation, so that there should be one basically giant Slavic-speaking area stretching from like Ukraine, Finland, Estonia, all of that area that eventually became part of the Soviet Union, all the way through Russia as one mega nation, essentially. In addition, then we have, from 1870 to 1871, the Franco-Prussian War. And I have a serious feeling Ms. Sherman is going to be asking us about this, because the Franco-Prussian War was something she especially wanted to highlight. So something that she really wanted us to know is that the Prussians were brutal to the French here. The Franco-Prussian War was essentially engineered by Otto von Bismarck as a strategy to build up Prussia's political might and allow it to create one giant German state. So the Franco-Prussian War, during this war, Prussia sieged Paris, blocking off their food supply, allowing them literally to only travel by air, which was pretty impossible at that time. Now, this led to a German state ruled by Wilhelm I and Otto von Bismarck. Wilhelm I is not so important here, but Otto von Bismarck is one of the most important figures towards the end of this time period, because he pursued something known as realpolitik, which is the ends justify the means based on whatever situation. So whether that meant war, whether that meant somehow like tricking your enemies, that is realpolitik that he was practicing here. In addition, so this led to the creation of a very strong German state that would rapidly industrialize and catch up to states even as like industrialized as Britain. Now, from 1861 to 71, the Wars of Italian Unification led to an Italian state ruled by Vittorio Emanuele II, Victor Emmanuel II. And so key figures here were Garibaldi, known as the Sword, Mazzini, known as the Soul, and Cavour, known as the Brain. And these three figures really helped inspire the Italian people to unite from Sardinia, Piedmont, all across from the very, very split Italy that was happening at the time. It was like more rule in the south, a bunch of city-states and papal states in the center, and then Austrian influence in the north. So he basically so Cavour especially, but all of these guys, Cavour, Garibaldi, and Mazzini, all work to create an Italian state that is like pretty self-sustaining here. In addition, 1871 to 1914, after all of these wars, is something known as the Long Peace, which is a period of relative stability among European empires, but Otto von Bismarck, the important German chancellor, was dismissed by Wilhelm here, which really kind of rocked European peace, because von Bismarck was really the main guy holding this all together. The guy who was the architect of European peace, a careful planner, founder of Germany, which was an important state at this time, and eventually led to the 1890s, 1900s creation of a European alliance system that essentially divided the two major armed industrialized powers into different camps. There was the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, and Italy, and eventually, the Franco-Russian alliance between France and Russia that was then joined by the British to form the Triple Entente. That meant that basically, as we're kind of seeing today with like the NATO and with like Russian NATO, I forgot what it's called, any crisis could involve all major potential powers, leading to an all-out, full-scale war across all of Europe. Now, I'm going to go into some political developments in each region that we have here because just to break it down, because there's a lot of stuff that's happening right now. Sorry, I just want to do a time check. Okay. So we have most European governments aiming to limit liberalism, minimize change, undo revolutionary impact, because they were thinking that would lead to a decline in their power and a political chaos in a stance known as reaction. And this was the guiding principle of the aforementioned Congress of Vienna that ended the Napoleonic Wars, but essentially preserved an informal agreement to prevent change. Monarchies were encouraged, civil liberties restricted, censorship, secret police, trade unions and political parties illegal. And while this was somewhat lessened in parliamentary states through things like Britain's 1832 Reform Act and the 1830 Revolution in France, this was kind of the guiding principle across much of Europe, especially Central and Eastern Europe. Russia, even here during this period, still practiced serfdom, which was pretty much considered an ancient thing for much of Europe at this time. This is pretty much shattered in 1848 by the revolutions of 1848, which were caused by popular impatience with the revolutionary rule. Sorry, I'm catching spelling mistakes in here as I'm going. Socioeconomic stresses caused by industrialization, and a series of bad harvests in what was known as the Hungry 40s. That's me. So it began in France with the deposing of the king and the appointing of deposing of the ruler and Napoleon's nephew being appointed president. And it spread to much of Europe except England and Russia. 1849, though, these rebellions were crushed, but still had lasting effects by compelling Germany, Austria, Prussia to all grant constitutions at this time. So that was pretty major here, and demonstrated the growing political power of nationalism, because nationalism is what drove all of this. It also inspired Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels to write the Communist Manifesto, which was a belief in the rights of the workers and the rights of the individual to be able to have certain strong a class overthrow. And I'm going to go more into communism and what the Communist Manifesto is later, but just for a general idea. The Second and Third Reform Acts of Britain extended vote to British middle classes, expanded labor and economic laws to help the lower classes, but Britain was still wrestling with key issues of Irish nationalism and women's suffrage at this time. Now, in 1851, if no one could have guessed, Louis Napoleon crowns himself Napoleon III and modernizes Paris. However, in 1871, he abdicates due to the humiliation during the Franco-Prussian War, the horrible suffering of the French people. And this eventually leads to a short, bloody revolution and democratic republic, although women could still not vote. Now is something that I have a feeling Miss Sherman likes to talk about a lot, and I have a feeling she's going to put this on the test, even though my personal guess is that this would never be on an AP test. So just something to know for this test, not necessarily for the AP test. The Dreyfus Affair, well, that's important, is that it exposed European anti-Semitism when the government falsely blamed a Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, for leaking military secrets to Germany. And this controversy sort of divided the right and the left in France, between the left saying he was not guilty and the right saying he was guilty. And while Dreyfus was eventually exonerated, Austrian journalists, now this is the part that I think Ms. Sherman would test us on, and that may not be on the AP, Theodor Herzl, and ended up founding the Zionist movement for a Jewish state, which was sort of supported by a lot of Ashkenazi Jews or European Jews during this time, and was supported by rich people even, such as the Baron, oh gosh, what's his name? All the streets in Israel are named after him. But essentially, there are a lot of European Jewish funders at this time who the Europeans were essentially demonizing because they'd been demonizing Jews. So that's sort of the important thing to know here. The 1860s, Italy was unified, as I previously mentioned, as a parliamentary monarchy, and Germany was unified with the German emperor sharing power with the Reichstag. And in Germany, all adult males could vote secretly and equally. And Otto von Bismarck in Germany helped Germany rapidly, and when I say rapidly, I mean rapidly industrialize with state-directed industrialization. Because really, they caught up to Britain in like a quarter of the time. That was really rapid. So it was the most generous economic concessions in Europe to the lower classes by Otto von Bismarck. And that was sort of to avoid them falling into socialism, because he was really worried about that. Von Bismarck was something of a conservative, but he believed in sort of outplaying the enemy by, like, telling them essentially they could have everything that they want with von Bismarck while he could still implement conservative policies. In 1861, Austria creates a parliament and concessions to minorities, and in 1867, the Ausgleich granted equal status to the Hungarians, renaming the state the Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, anti-Semitism against Jews in this area was still pretty rampant. In 1861, Alexander II of Russia emancipates the serfs, and makes many liberal changes, but is eventually assassinated by radicals, and many of his later conservative successors undo many of the liberal changes. Now, 1904 to 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. Now, this is a little bit after the time period, but plays into the general idea that Japan is working on colonization at this time. It leads to a terrible Russian defeat, and eventually the 1905 revolution, which nearly dethrones Nicholas II for the war's unpopularity, and leads to the creation of the Duma, which is the Russian parliament. And although Nicholas would later weaken the Duma once public opinion shifted back in his favor, this led to anti-Semitism and pogroms, which became more and more common in late Tsarist Russia. Now, in the Middle East and Central Asia during the 1700s, due to, like, outside invaders, the Safavid Empire pretty much fades out. Now, you guys might remember, this was a pretty important empire during the last time period, but here it's kind of losing its real, like, shine, its real importance. In addition, the 1800s to the 1900s see the Ottoman Empire losing a lot of its land due to wars with Russia and Austria, as well as Islamic traditionalists and elites, barring sultans who saw reform and modernization to sort of keep up with the modern world. In addition, some of these elites include the Janissaries, whose system, while very helpful in the last time period, somewhat became outdated during this time period and really blocked the attempts to improve the military power. Eventually, in the 1820s, the Janissary power was broken and the army and navy were upgraded, helping contribute to the 1839 to 76 Tanzimat reforms, which promoted religious tolerance, equality, Western science, Western technology, industrialization, infrastructure, liberalization, secularization of the legal system, all of these things that we sort of think of as part of the Western world. And if I may mention, scientific revolution, I'm not really going to cover that in here. She might be covering it on the test. If you want to hear about the scientific revolution, take a look at my last video I posted, and take a look at the 1450 to 1750 study guide, because that's really where that stuff is going to be. Now, on to Sultan Abdul Hamid II of the Ottoman Empire. He proclaimed the Constitution of 1786, which first shared power with an elected legislature. However, 1878, he suspends the Constitution, ending pretty much the Tanzimat movement, as he was caught between the traditionalists and modernizers known as the Young Turks. Now, 1821 to 32, there's the Greek War of Independence, leading to interventions by Britain and Russia, and those led to anti-Turkish sentiments in both of these in Europe and both of these places especially, as well as nationalist sentiments among Balkan Christians who sort of surrounded the Greeks and saw what was going on there. Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, made Egypt autonomous around this time, making a Western military and industrializing the Egyptian cotton industry. He governed autocratically as something known as a khedive, and subjected farmers and textile workers to really poor conditions here, as well as attempting to take Syria from the Ottomans. In 1830, the French they owe a huge debt to Algeria for all the wheat that they've been importing, and the French basically just decide, we're not going to pay for all that, so they just colonize Algeria. They take it from the Ottomans, and really brutally, if I may add. It led to a lot of death happening and a lot of injuries. 1853, Russia is invading the Ottoman provinces along the Danube, provoking the Crimean War. In 1867 to 78, we're really seeing like the Balkan crisis of the Bulgarians, the Serbs, and many others revolting against the harsh Ottoman economic policy, as well as their general lack of modernization and continued repression. Russia helps these nations, and eventually, under a European negotiated treaty, these rebel nations go free. Now, the North Africa begins to fall under European influence here, and a notable example of this is the 1854-69 construction of the Suez Canal by the French Suez Canal colony, led by Fernand de Lesseps. Now, this gave France an economic leverage, which was later passed to Britain when they saved Egypt from an 1881 revolt. In 1881, the British established the Anglo-Egyptian administration, essentially replacing the Suez Canal Company, which would transfer political power to the British here. And that was basically the Ottomans would lose Tunisia to France, Morocco to the French and Spanish, and Libya to Italy. And just before I get to the Young Turks here, an important thing to note here is that really what we're seeing in the Middle East is a pattern of Ottomans losing progressively their political power and political influence across much of their region, and European colonial industrial power sort of gaining that power. Now, as we see things like Russia waging war in Central Asia to gain natural resources, territory, securing their border, and that led to the Great Game rivalry that I already mentioned. 1908 to 1909, so this is a little bit after the time period, but maybe mention the Young Turks, led by Enver Pasha, depose the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and restore the constitution. They install a figurehead sultan, but really pursue a policy of industrialization, secularization, economic reform, and forge close ties with Germany in World War I that would eventually lead to the empire's demise. However, an important thing to note here that we will learn about in the next unit for sure is the Armenian genocide, which is fueled by the nationalist sentiments of the Young Turks here, and is sort of like trying to showcase Ottoman nationalism and Ottoman power. Now, as we go into more of sub-Saharan Africa area, Ottoman Empire was controlling North Africa, but most African societies around the start of this time period were resisting foreign power, worked with foreign powers. The Barbary states in Islamic North Africa were ruled by the Ottomans, but became increasingly autonomous. However, an important thing to note about interactions with Europe here is that the corsairs, or the pirates around here, threatened American and European shipping by taking captives and would be part of the provocation of the French colonization of Algeria in 1830. Additionally, the Ashanti or the Asante Kingdom in West Africa built up its military with money from the Atlantic slave trade, threatening European outposts and trade routes with all of this military, and are basically fighting a series of wars with the British from 1823 up to all the way to 1902, so that they can stay independent and on their own. And a famous part of this, I'm going to go over this later, is Asante Wu's War, which was kind of a major example of African resistance to the British. If you all want to use that in your DBQ, I would highly recommend it. In addition, the Sokoto Caliphate around here was founded in present-day Nigeria in 1809 and fought the British until 1903. The Zulu kingdoms in the south were united by Shaka from 1816 to 1828, leading to really massive tribal migrations that became somewhat violent against the Boers and the British, and eventually led to the Zulu Wars of 1879, which pretty much eradicated the Zulu. Zanzibar continued to remain important in the East African slave trade, ruling the Zanj. In 1698, it was ruled by Oman. In 1840, it became the Omani capital. And in 1861, it becomes its own sultanate. Ethiopia, a Christian nation in Muslim East Africa, remained isolated from the 1600s to 1800s. That's really no easy feat here, because remember, all of this European influence and Ottoman influence on the continent is really encroaching upon Ethiopia's area. However, in the 1800s, Theodore II pursues military modernization, allowing them to be one of only two countries, Ethiopia and Liberia, that ended up warding off European forces. In 1896, there was victory over the Italian forces at Adowa, which is really kind of the only major victory native Africans have against any European colonial force. Sorry, I'm just moving my phone to the other side so that I can continue keeping an eye on where I am. Okay, so then we have South Africa, which was taken over by the British, as the Boers made something known as a Great Trek north in order to make their own states. The Boers, the British, the Xhosa, and the Zulu periodically fought until the Zulu War of 1879. And really, guns, germs, and steel here. We learned about this in Jared Diamond. We'll continue to learn about this. But the British and the Boers are able to basically just use their military power to, like, destroy the Xhosa and the Zulu and many other African tribes. The discovery of gold mines and diamond fields led to the eventual exploitation of African workers around here, and sort of, like, really enhanced how terrible the colonization would be. So then the French colonization. So I already mentioned about the French colonization of Algeria, but there was a resistance here led by Abd al-Qadir, who was respected for his dignity and bravery. Now, an important thing to know is the Xhosa cattle-killing movement, led by the prophet Nongqawuse, and they slaughtered cattle so that spirits would drive away the British. But this have only led to famine, pretty much. In 1900, the Ya Asantewa War, that's the one that I was trying to think about earlier, was the war between the British and the Asante, and part of that larger Asante resistance led by Ya Asantewa, sort of a mother figure among Asante people who really led this resistance, was a woman-led resistance, which is kind of rare for this time period. Now, 1800 to 1918 is the Scramble of Africa, which was to subjugate the entire continent, basically for Europe, and due to geographical and medical knowledge, Europeans could colonize the African continent. Civil, intertribal conflict, economic over-reliance on the African slave trade, all of this led to easier colonization of Africa, which really was sort of like the way that it kind of like really broke down the African social systems in this place. In addition, so we have the Berlin Conference, which we already discussed, but the British here, they were governing with selfishness, racism, condescension. They were training native elites and brought science, medicine, industrial technology from the West. Similar to France after Algeria, France was dominating the Sahara North and most of West Africa, and this was sort of exemplified during the Mandingo War, which was French victory of the Wassoulou Empire, founded by Samori Touré, where they sort of were able to conquer much of West Africa. In addition, Portuguese, Belgian, and German rule. Remember, Belgians and Germans are pretty new to this, and they are among the harshest, worst imperialist powers of this time. And now we see Leopold II of Belgium in the 1870s establishing his private company on the Congo that was so brutal in its rubber plantations that as many as 50% of the people died, and in a rare moment, the people of Belgium were so publicly outraged with these actions that they forced the government to take it from Leopold II and administer it themselves. From 1905 to 07, Germany kills 250,000 people to suppress the Maji-Maji revolt in East Africa. In 1904 to 1907, the Herero Wars, Germany is using concentration camps against civilians. We see where that comes from. Killing 80% of the Herero natives, and really considered the first genocide of the 20th century. Even before the Armenian genocide. Now, 1896, the Fashoda incident is a French-British fight over the Nile Valley, and is an example of one of the kind of pretty few intra-European fights among African territory at this time. So that's just something kind of notable to note. 1906 and 1911 are the Morocco crises, which sort of emerged due to German interference with the French and Spanish rule of Morocco. 1899 to 1902, Germany was publicly supporting the Afrikaners, or the Boers. I should probably clarify that in my study guide. The Afrikaners is another name for Boers, or Voers, or Voers, or however you end up spelling it. There are a whole lot of ways to do it. In the Boer War. And this sort of really angers the British and leads to rising British tensions with Germany. And both the rising French tensions I mentioned earlier and the rising British tensions I'm mentioning now are like kind of the key lead up to World War One. And now, again, British are using concentration camps here against the civilians in order to stop them from supporting the Boers, which is pretty terrible. Now, in East Asia in the late 1700s, the Qing China is wealthy, artistic, intellectual. They have a lot of political influence over tributary states, continuing China's role as essentially the most dominant, power in Asia and one of the most dominant powers in the world. From 1863 to 1895, the Qianlong Emperor rules, and he's really the last capable Qing ruler. Now, that means that we are essentially seeing like the decline of the Qing Empire here, because after his reign, Confucian-based social stratification remained rigid, the cost of defending northern, western frontiers, population growth was burdening the economy. The 1796 to 1804 White Lotus Rebellion was the first of many popular discontents during this period in China that led to uprisings. The late 1700s to early 1800s, the Europeans and the Americans could barely trade with China, pretty much only in the port of Canton. And the Chinese sold silk, porcelain, and tea, but only accepted silver, not really Western goods, leading to an imbalanced trade system. In 1793, the Macartney mission from Britain petitioned the emperor to open a British embassy so that they could sell goods, but the emperor famously said, "There is nothing your country has that we need." Now, the Qing still believed at this point that China is the Middle Kingdom. Outsiders were barbarians, despite the fact that they were beginning to lose their advantages in technology, science, and military power due to the social stagnation of the Qing. The British and the Western nations started economic imperialism in China by flooding China with opium from India, a highly, highly addictive drug that caused farmers to be unable to work. This reversed the economic of power favoring the West, but Trade Commissioner Lin Sheshu asked the British to end the trade here. However, this eventually, because the British didn't, Sheshu confiscated opium from British warehouses in Canton, threw it into the ocean, very reminiscent of the Boston Tea Party, also during this time period. From 1839 to 42, it was easily won by the British. The Opium War here leading to the Treaty of Nanking or Nanjing, the first of many unequal treaties between China and Britain that basically forced the Qing to open more ports of foreign trade, lower their tariffs, surrender Hong Kong to Britain, and pay reparations. From 1850s to 60s, the Franco-British assault on Beijing and trade conflicts lead to more unequal treaties, legalizing the opium trade, opening more ports, allowing Western nations to set up foreign concessions, which were areas where their laws prevailed. Foreign vessels could also now sail all the way up Chinese rivers. From 1850 to 1864, due to this huge Western influence, the Taiping Rebellion, led by Hong Xiuquan, a Cantonese clerk who claimed to be Jesus' brother, and was supposedly destined to establish a heavenly kingdom of supreme peace in China, organized an army, rallying ordinary anti-Qing Chinese, and opposed foot binding, and eventually really controlled a third of China. However, Qing forces were assisted by the foreigners and recovered this land by the 1860s. In 1864, Hong committed suicide and the rebellion collapsed. The 1860s, there was the strengthening movement reform campaign as a result, primarily of the popular discontent from the Taiping Rebellion. It was launched by the Qing government. It was limited to really just economic and military modernization without meaning social change, and was opposed by the powerful conservative Dowager Empress Cixi, who pretty much controlled the emperor here. And while this was good intentioned, the internal fights here led to decay, economic decline, and diplomatic humiliation of China. In 1883, the French take Indochina from China. In 1894 to 95, the Sino-Japanese Wars won by Japan, leading to their occupations of Korea and Taiwan, then known as Formosa. 1899, the U.S.'s open door policy allowed all Western nations equal access to Chinese markets, which really sort of reshaped Western control of East Asia here. In the summer of 1900, the Yihuetan Revolt... if I may mention something about the open door policy that I forgot to earlier, major transnational corporations established themselves in places like Hong Kong, such as HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Company, which sort of controlled banking around this area, and that was sort of pretty important here. In summer of 1900, the Yihuetan Revolt, or the Boxer Rebellion, driven by anger at foreign influence, drought, and unemployment, happened. It was originally repressed by the Qing, but Cixi later, wanted to express her anger at the West and saw this, not repressing them as the way to do so. However, in the fall of 1901, it was quashed by the Western nations, who, in their anger, burned Chinese temples and forced reparations from the Qing, who supported them. Now, who supported the Boxers, sorry. Cixi now would form a committee to consider writing a constitution, but it was really too late here. In the 1700s to the 1800s, the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan kept their dictatorial rule and social stratification that really favored the samurai and the upper classes. They enjoyed urbanization, proto-industrialization, and only allowed very, very little trade in Nagasaki, which is a city in the south. Well, was a city in the south and then eventually had to get rebuilt due to World War II. 1853, though, prior to 1853, Miss Sherman might mention this just for a little trivia here. A man named Townsend Harris was the ambassador to Japan, and Townsend Harris was important here because he sort of tried to open up trade with Japan in peaceful ways. However, on the less peaceful side, Townsend Harris's successor, Commodore Matthew Perry, essentially brings a bunch of gunships in, presents the Japanese with the gift of a white flag, and says, trade with us, otherwise, with the implied threat of invasion, if not. Now, similar demands by other Western nations end up following, and then eventually, basically, the shogun are forced to capitulate here. Now, the samurai are angered by this capitulation and restore the emperor to full authority in something known as the 1868 Meiji Restoration. This led to Japan being led by someone known as the Meiji Emperor, who industrialized Japan's economy, modernized social and political life, allowed Japan to emerge as an imperial power, and really is the most and pretty much the only successful non-Western industrialization and imperialism, brought political positions back to being on the basis of merit and the civil service exam, based on essentially Confucian principles from China. Industrialization increased the size, the influence of the merchant and middle classes, which lessened the feudal prejudices here, and the lower classes began to gain access to public education, allowing them to serve in the military. The samurai lost their hereditary privileges, including immunity from taxes, annual subsidies, right to wear swords, somewhat similar, actually, to, if you want to draw some sort of a comparison to the French Revolution at this time, because that was also happening there. The Constitution of 1890 in Japan created something known as the National Diet, which actually even still exists in a form today, because that was essentially the parliament. And if you guys see a note, like a sort of continuity here among many countries, there were all sorts of countries were creating popular methods of sovereignty, seeing major social upheavals, major economic upheavals as a result of this industrialization and newfound power in the lower classes. However, if we mention about the Diet, we have to mention that only 5% of people could vote due to restrictions, and the emperor still was exercising control over the Diet. I'm sorry, I think you guys may have also gotten this notification. I do only have 1 minute 45 seconds remaining on this live. I'm going to start another live, if it lets me on this account, if not on my other account, to continue sort of talking about this. Now, the Civil Code of 1898 was an update to the legal system. However, there were still poor conditions for women. Taxes ended up increasing for farmers. Working conditions were still poor for the lower classes. Western science, the calendar, dress, and manners, metric systems were all adopted by the elite and middle classes. And the Japanese Army and Navy were adopting British and German technology, tactics, and organizational methods. And this all kind of shows how Japan was essentially trying to replicate the progress that the West had in its industrialization here by essentially replicating the West in every way. finally, on this live, the thing I'm going to talk about right now is Japan was expanding in the 1870s as it was resource poor and nationalism was swelling. So they took, in 1879, the Ryukyu Islands from China. They forced China to grant it foreign concessions as it had to other European nations. In 1894 to 1895, Japan took Taiwan and Korea after the Sino-Japanese War, and in 1904 to 1905, they took the Kuril Islands and Sakhalin in the Russo-Japanese War. Okay, I'm going to start another live. This one will all be posted, so the information is all posted.